All right, here we are with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Got my coffee cup, got my drink, and of course we have another great guest, a good friend, a good colleague, a true brother, Lance Kelley. Hey Lance, we're doing these coffee talks as a way to introduce people to the folks in the network, in the family of the WPC. And so we're glad you're here to talk a little bit about yourself, your work, and your partnership collaboration with the WPC. So let's just get started by asking you to introduce yourself, who you are, and what is it that you do?
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I've been watching a few of these. But like Eddie said, my name is Lance Paradise Kelley. Basically raised in Oklahoma. I'm a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, but also a descendant of the Shoshoni-Paiute tribes from Nevada. So that's where my Paradise, that's a family name. So that's where that comes from. But been living in Oneida, Wisconsin for 23 years now. I was very fortunate to marry a woman from Oneida. So I've been up here on the reservation, which is located right outside of Green Bay. So it's kind of known as an urban reservation. So that's kind of the geographic little background. But currently, and I just completed or will be next week, my 14th year working at a local community college, Northeast Wisconsin Technical College. And before that, I was 10 years at the Oneida Nation Tribal School, the high school. So that's kind of so I've been in education for 25 years. Sounds weird saying that, but but definitely very proud of that work. And I've been very fortunate to really have 3 jobs in my last 27 years, I think. I started off middle school in Oklahoma, then moved up here and have 2 jobs. So I've been very fortunate, and you know, that word privilege definitely comes into play, having that opportunity just to work and enjoy what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I've always been a believer and working at ground level, grassroots, whatever you want to call it. I did some national stuff throughout my younger years, but I just felt like I wanted to be on the front lines per se, working at a tribal school, a native school, you know, low income, what we used to know, at-risk students. And now even in the higher ed, you know, some of our clientele, some of our students are definitely come from that background, and we're definitely seeing that right now, you know, what's going on in our society. So we're kind of facing some of those realities with these type of situations. So that's a good beginning. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, well, there are so many questions that just that introduction raised up that I'm going to be trying to get through all of those. So being that the two of us know each other very well, we need to be concise because I got a lot to ask you, my brother. And in addition to that, I wanted to ask you about COVID-19, but I'm going to get to that. But I want to start with some basic stuff because I feel like there's some things I want people to be able to learn from this that I wish I had known in earlier days. For example, do I say First Nation? Do I say Native American? What's your sense of that in reference to what do I say?
And, you know, I think, Eddie, you and I met pretty close to 10 years ago at a conference, national conference. And I think we just kind of hit it all personally and professionally. But, you know, I did, you know, one of the first things I heard you talk about was that First Nation term. And, you know, you get into semantics and all these different words. To me, it doesn't really matter. You know, now that is more of a political Canadian term that they use, First Nations, reserves. But for us here in the States, the lower 48, you know, it just depends how your own personal viewpoint, you know, it's gone through different changes throughout the last 30 plus years. I myself, you know, Native people, Indigenous people, that's kind of the term I use. But, you know, American Indians out there, you know, in my classroom, we talk about that word Indian and, you know, how it's a misnomer, it's a mistake. And we know that story. But we still use that term. You know, we've been told, we've been socialized ourselves at some level. We call it Indian country, you know. So that term, but I think people, as long as they're very gracious about it and just, hey, I'm not quite sure I use this term, I think most people will have a very deeper level conversation regarding that. So no problem with that, First Nations at all.
Well, what about Thanksgiving, right? Like, do I celebrate it? Do I say it? Give me some of your thoughts about Thanksgiving, because I think sometimes people are not confused if they should do it, if it's offensive. How do you talk to your kids about it? What's your thought about Thanksgiving?
Well, you know, from an education standpoint, definitely I presented many times on just that topic. And I do a little segment in my current classes, higher ed classes, and just, you know, as long as they don't celebrate the event and they think it's real, because it didn't happen, especially in November, it didn't happen that time. It was all kind of created by the federal government, that term. There was a place and a time where you had the Wampanoags come together. It really wasn't all, you know, get around a table, but they did interact, and there were those interactions. So there is some basis to that history, but what we do today, you know, on that Thursday is definitely not how it was. So, and I think in a lot of schools, and even elementary and middle schools, are starting to realize that and teach it where they are learning about the true meaning of Thanksgiving. So it has taken positive steps. Just remember to, you know, the real history, and there's several articles. One's called The Real Thanksgiving Story, okay? So there's plenty of information out there to learn if you're interested. You know, we sit around, but it's also about just who your family, time of just being thankful. That's what we kind of use that, but it's not always a special day, you know, so we kind of got away from that perspective a little bit. Sometimes it's just another Thursday. So it just depends, but just understanding the education value of that. So.
And what about Columbus?
Well, that's a big
Columbus
one.
Day.
I knew that was coming.
Yeah.
Definitely, I think you're seeing some major shifts in education society where city governments are changing the name. You know, I think you did some work earlier, and, you know, we did some work together about that. The Indigenous Day, I think most, you know, there are places, Denver, Seattle, have definitely changed that framework of Columbus Day, and that's definitely probably the bigger one, and just really understanding the history of Columbus, what happened before and afterwards, and just talk about, you know, and sometimes I have to be careful when you know, that famous date, you know, 90, 92, you know, history starts then according to some history books, okay? So we got to get away from that and understand pre-Columbus and just what occurred. But there's a whole segment. There's tons and tons of information out there. I think you've done a good job sharing some of that stuff with people, young people, and, you know, older generations can definitely have a various levels of conversation with that.
Now, lots of people, I think, more and more now are doing some kind of land acknowledgement, land recognition. Can you give a sense of how important that is, and should every organization start their program with some kind of land acknowledgement?
Well, we are definitely, even at NWTC, we are working on this right now as we speak. We're in the process. About 10 members of the Native community in our organization kind of started to talk about this, but this has been going on. You're seeing it more in, you know, organizations, colleges, local governments at some level, recognizing, trying to acknowledge the land that they are operating on. So you're definitely seeing some people doing this, you know, and, you know, for me personally, and, you know, our relationship, this is where, you know, I've been trying to do this for now 7, 8, 9 years at the Privilege Institute, you know, the conference, and always trying to find that local historic, current tribe. Sometimes that always hasn't worked out. And find that person that can kind of tell that story. I think one of the better ones was definitely when we were in Michigan, where we were right on the river, the Grand River, and really understanding that history of that. And I didn't know that myself, and then being out in Seattle and definitely, different places, and having that knowledge and just letting people know, hey, we are on the historic lands. And like I said, we at NWTC are kind of dealing with this right now, trying to formulate that wording, that paragraph. When do we want to use it? What's the purpose? Who's going to use it? And our other 2 colleges in town have done it already too. So you're definitely seeing that in different places.
Yeah. So can you explain what a powwow is? Right? And is it important for everyone in the community to participate? What's the value of participation if that's important? Just give us a sense, because I don't know if people even know. They may hear this word, may see this word, may see these events happening. Can you just talk a little bit about the importance of powwows, what they are, and also who participates, who should participate? Should I bring my kids? Should other families bring kids? And what are the benefits?
Now, how much time do we have here? But long story short here, definitely, it's more of a modern concept, the modern day powwow. Most tribes have some type of powwow gathering, depending on the location. But, before the last 2 months, you could say there was a powwow every weekend in this, someplace in this, someplace. And they're just a place to gather. They have a long history that goes back into the boarding school concepts, when people got together, different groups, and they wanted to sing and dance together. I mean, you have that somewhat history there, but it's generally most are open, and definitely general public. The one here in Oneida, it's always on 4th of July weekend. It draws thousands and thousands of people. You have colleges that, they're smaller versions. You have winter powwows. And yes, generally they're always open to the public. People are welcome. Non-native people, a lot of times, as we know, invite people, invite your family, and it is generally a place of this kind of getting together and socialize, and with that cultural element also, and the music and the dance, and and different families participate more or less. So myself and my family definitely, I've been dancing since I was basically 5 years old, and now my daughter does. My wife, we all participate in various ways at different dances, different tribes. So we definitely have that knowledge and that experience. But it is generally open, and people just ask. I mean, that's generally, and flyers are out there. So they're on Facebook now, and ironically now, with all this social distance, there's actually a website out there called Social Distance Powwow. And they are been doing this every weekend. A gentleman up in, I think he's Canadian, he basically started, him and his wife. And now you have over 200,000 people who've joined, and they have, they're having contests. And now in the modern day powwow is a lot of times contests, high money. So our friends have participated, they're posting their videos online, and then people are voting for them. You have singers. So it's really a unique experience that's happening just like we are right now. So
yeah. Can you talk about, you mentioned this a little bit, the boarding schools. I think sometimes people think of boarding schools and they think of the fancy, expensive. I mean, what comes up for you, and what is often misunderstood or not known about the indigenous people's experience at boarding schools here in America?
Well, like I said, there's a lot of research on that. I think one of the major things, there's a book, and that slogan was "Kill the Indian, Save the Man." I mean, that was kind of the slogan throughout the time, where they basically took kids, native kids, as young as 3, 4 years old, and shipped them off to these places, off reservations, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, where they had to stay there. And they were generally run, this is 1887 was Carlisle, probably the most famous one, and Jim Thorpe, the greatest athlete of all time, came from that. That's where he got his start from an athletic standpoint. but you have thousands and tens of thousands of families impacted by this. Today, the generation trauma, sometimes it's called boarding school trauma, where they were abused in every fashionable way possible. And I don't think we need to go too far. And I think people probably would understand that element. And that's the negative and the impact it had on generations. Today, there's still a few run, but they're run by tribes. And, you know, a lot of times, even Oneida, even though it's not a boarding school, it's you know, it's based on its language and culture. So you have a lot more native influence, native teachers. So you still have these few places around the country, but most are closed down. Today, most, you know, school-age children go to public schools, you know, in local areas. So that's, but the history of 120 years, it really has impacted our 3-4 generations now.
Yeah, thank you. I think I heard someone talk about how oxymoronic that term is, boarding school, when you think about the treatment, the experience, the actual experience that Indigenous folks had to endure during that time. Let me ask you about Land O'Lakes and some of the, some would say positive changes they've made, but how that relates to the larger issue of mascots and some of what we're seeing in some places in reference to progress and some places still hanging on to the old.
You know, I think the top of the mountain is that term, the R term, you know, from the football team. I think that's the ultimate one, and which has not seen positive change. And once again, I do plenty of work on this topic, but you know, these minimal or these small, but they're positive. Like you said, the company itself had to make a decision, you know, taking that image off of that, and that's one of the iconic ones. You know, even my mom, I mean, she mentioned this to me just a couple weeks ago. So, and I just heard about, she probably saw it within a day or two. So, you know, I guess small steps, if you want to say that, moving forward. But, you know, here in Wisconsin, we have a long battle with the high school mascots, and, you know, the imaging of it. And so this is kind of the hotbed of it in Wisconsin, but it's going across the country too. But once again, it's a localized, regional, national debate and discussion that will continue on. You know, and you have politics involved. I think newspapers have recognized, some newspapers won't use the word. So it is here, you know, it depends where you are, will determine how involved it can be, but definitely it's out there.
Yeah. Now, is it official that when we have baseball back, that Cleveland has made a decision around their old visual presentation to a new visual?
Well, you know, and they have actually done this for the last couple of years, where they use a C now instead of the old ironic Chief Wahoo image, which goes back 100 years. But I have still seen it out there, especially in the crowds, you know, and, you know, with people, and it goes, there's several of these examples. I think another one is University of Illinois. You know, that was a big debate back in the 90s and early 2000s, and where you have their mascot. He's officially retired, but he is still around. I mean, last fall, you know, during homecoming, you had this group who basically sponsored him. So you have that, and you have other ones. And I think you and I talked about during the Super Bowl, and I was worried. I was like, oh man, Kansas City Chiefs, you know, the chefs, you know, that play on that words. But I didn't watch the whole game, but I watched most of it, and I did not see one headdress, you know, from now. Was it ironic they didn't show it? I don't know. Or did NBC really made a conscious effort? I would like to find that out, because I did not see one. And most times that's what you see, and, you know, in commercials and previous, you know, clips with the Kansas City team. So that was interesting to really find out. Maybe they did. I like to think they did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, just not the public presentation of it was pretty impressive. And yeah, thank you for that. I was going to ask you about the term chief of staff. chief executive officer. We had someone a couple episodes ago talking about chairman
Right.
and chairman and changing that terminology. What's your sense of, I don't know if there's any roots in that in reference to like the mascots are, and should we be making efforts to change those titles?
That's a long battle there, I think. You know, I don't think there's a lot of history with that from our perspective. But some of these terms I was missing, you know, some of the leadership, you know, tribal chairman, like you were talking about, or governor, you know, based on his more historical, you know, some of those, in my tribe actually uses the word chief, you know, and so there is some of that. I just don't think we're there yet. I mean, I think that's something that has been ingrained in us for a long time also. So that's another discussion. I'm not, and you were mentioning earlier about what you heard, or you guys had a discussion about that. So that'd be interesting.
Yeah. It just makes me wonder like where the term came from, if it has the same kind of root or history of mascots in reference to ball teams and all those kinds of things. And if that's something we should also be possibly
I lost you.
looking, just wondering if it's got the same kind of history as some of the mascots and mascot names, and if we should be working to change that like we are some of those names.
I don't think the same history is that associated with that. As far as I know, I haven't really done that much research on that.
All right. Let me ask you about COVID-19, because I think that there's not been much, at least I can tell, information about Indigenous people when it comes to people of color. I mean, I hear a lot of disparities with relationship to people of color, but a lot of times it's Latinx and African American. So can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing, what you're finding out, what you know about the impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous people across the nation?
Well, I think this is another point I like to stress too, is, you know, over 560 different tribes in our country, and you probably have 560 different spectrums and stories. Very vast spectrum. You have here in Oneida, who have 12 reported cases, and we're right outside of Green Bay, like I said earlier. They're monitoring it, everything's shut down. But you got other places, and the other extreme is the Dene, the Navajo Nation. You know, I don't know the latest. I mean, was it 700? But definitely, you know, a very high number. And I was surprised because it is a very rural, so spread out. So it is the largest reservation in this country. But you have these very, very gathering small towns, and that's that's generally probably where, you know, a lot of the cases are located. Then you got everything in between, and tribes, and once again you got how much resources do they have. My tribe in Nevada, very limited, you know, and there are some tribes, and my tribe in Nevada hasn't done it officially, but I know a tribe in northern Minnesota basically shut their reservation off, and they had gained access, so they didn't want cases brought in, so they were very trying to stop that from the beginning. My immediate families, I mean, they were worried about food supply. I mean, that from the beginning, you know, and they have to travel 2 hours sometimes to go get, you know, large quantities. They have a store, but it ran out pretty quickly. So you have definitely a lot of different situations going on, and, you know, Oneida has some resources on health service, so they definitely have provided that. I'm not too familiar with some other tribes, you know, northern here, but it's probably not as equipped as some. So yesterday, as we kind of mentioned earlier, you know, the president was in Arizona, and he met with 2 tribes, and there was like 8 tribes in Arizona, but he only met with 2, you know, and Navajo Nation was 1, and then the Gila River was 1. So they kind of got some funds for the state, for the tribes. trying to fight this. So that's kind of just in a very, basic level understanding.
Now, you mentioned Jim Thorpe, and it made me think about the history and historic portrayal of Jim Thorpe. And I don't even know if people still know a lot about him. And you mentioned the greatest athlete ever. I mean, you added some pretty strong language associated with Jim Thorpe. But it made me think about the relationship between African Americans and Indigenous people. And I've just, over the years heard some, stories here and there, bits and pieces about the connection, the collaboration. What's your sense of the history of Indigenous people, African Americans, particularly in the earliest part of American history?
Well, a lot of it came from, slavery, where you had tribes who actually owned slaves, had slaves in the 1800s, especially in the southeast part of the country. You had slaves who escaped and tribes took them in, which are still political questions today. You have lawsuits based on this because you get into then enrollments, all those other questions. But that's where a lot of it came from. And then when you had tribes forcibly move from the East Coast, different parts, especially Oklahoma, they brought their slaves, and some were and they had adopted them already. So this interaction, relationships throughout the years, and there's several key documents out there where you have people who are mixed, and a lot of mixed bloods today. I mean, across the board, Native people have at the highest mixed ratio of you have that history. A lot of pro athletes are, I think the most recent one that really has talked about is Kyrie Irving. He went to Standing Rock a couple years ago. He's got a couple deals, that the Native perspective. So he's gotten some stuff, and he's done some stuff with that. So you definitely have, but unfortunately, in some of my own research, a lot of African Americans, they can't trace it back all the way. I mean, the records and all that. So that's probably some know, they've heard through their families' stories, but they really don't know. Yeah. And then here they are today, living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Denver, and they see these Native tribes, and gaming, of course, comes in play, and economics, and they want to be part of that. So that's where some of the legal part has come in controversy. Are they members of this tribe or not today? Their ancestors were brought, 100 years ago. So there are some legal issues with that. And it is very, very problematic. I mean, this is something that's not going away for a little bit. So but that's kind of just relating that story.
So can you talk a little bit about, Green Bay, the community, the area where we live here, and some of the positive impact that the Oneida Nation, which you find yourself, primarily connected, involved, married into. What are some of the things that are happening in the Green Bay area that are directly a result of the presence of Oneida Nation, Indigenous people here?
Well, I think it goes back to kind of what you were talking about, the land acknowledgement, and Oneidas are not originally from here. They were forcibly removed. Some volunteered from New York. So now they've been here since 1820s and 30s. This was original Menominee territory. There's always kind of a inside joking with each other between Menominees and Oneida. Even today, there's a lot of intermarriage, and they always joke, well, we gave you that land, so forth and so forth. So you have, these two tribes within 45 minutes of each other, but Oneida, very fortunate, being located next to a city, definitely has helped. And from a gaming economic standpoint, gaming's been here officially since 1988 was the official federal law that came into play, which basically opened that door for gaming, and that the word sovereignty. I mean, I have to mention that now at some point. I think people sometimes hear that word. What does that really mean? But having that inherent ability to govern yourself. So that's a big part of it. But fast forward 30 years now, and gaming is here. Oneida, operates several gaming facilities. They have 50 different retail businesses operate. Have gas stations. They have their own school system, their own healthcare, their own police force. So you have a very localized, you have an inherent government, and that's kind of what they are. Where comparable to other tribes, and there are differences, and up north, it is different. You just don't have the population, the income, so that definitely drives different forces in regards to that. But here, Oneida has its own its gate at Lambeau Field, which is not cheap. Okay. I can say some of the stuff because I'm not Oneida, but definitely being part of it. And seriously, I've been part of this community for a long time. I've taught in the school system. Now my former students, and one's he's a basketball coach for the girls now. So he's definitely many others former cops now. So been here in that regard, and politically, teaching for a long time definitely has let me know families, teach families, and just share some of that community that we are. And I think that's the bigger part of this too. This is like any small community. You have connections wherever you're from. So my daughter now, who is a tribal member, definitely is born and raised in Oneida. She knows that. So I think that's a critical part. I grew up in a city, and you kind of had that distinction growing up. Were you an urban Indian? Were you a reservation Indian? And it's still played today. It still is. It's not probably as prevalent as it once was. But I grew up in Tulsa, and I was, and then that's what I did. So definitely I enjoy living more on the land base and community feel. So just once again, a very long story in a short manner.
Yeah. So can you, in our last few minutes, I wanted to talk a little bit about so what are you teaching at the college, and what has been some of your experiences there as a community member, as a professor at the college?
Okay, I think I got most of it. I did lose you, but what's the connection with that at the college?
Well, I was wondering, what are you teaching at the college?
Oh, okay.
And what has been some of the things that you've been able to accomplish in reference to your job there at the college?
So I've been there, like I said, 14 years, and we have a general transfer certificate, which students can come here and get 32 credits. And one of the credits is my class called Intro to Diversity. It's mandated for every program except nursing, just because they are loaded from day one. So this is basically how I got my job 14 years ago, and I was teaching Oneida. And then luckily I knew a tribal member who was married to someone that worked there. He called me and they said, "Hey, are you interested?" Definitely I was at the time. So that's kind of how I started. Been doing that now, like I said. And the class itself definitely we get into all the mascot issue, and what's going on, and the COVID, and we'll talk about that probably in a second here, but definitely relating that to what's happening in our society, on various topics. And today we're talking about, ageism, and how that's relatable to all of us. And we talk about Social Security for the younger people to understand, so we get all these different topics. Race is kind of the base of it, but, classism, definitely, I bring a lot of that into. I think a lot of people don't realize the impact of that. And we're seeing that right now in our society, the haves and have not, and who's getting treated, and so forth and so forth. So, definitely, I think most students enjoy, or at least they may not have the most positive thinking initially, but once they get in there, we have a lot of discussions in that regard. My second part is our faculty training, and I'm one of two facilitators who basically they take a 20-hour training over 4 times, and we bring speakers in. You've been a speaker, and we just get into deeper level conversations about their own experience. And a lot of times we focus on their own experience. A lot of our faculty come from rural areas. They're our former students. because our population is changing. I think we all use this, Green Bay Public Schools now is 55% minority, I think, and people are starting to realize there are future students, so we need to prepare ourselves and also make sure, the achievement gap gets better. And that's always the ultimate goal too. So that's just another, a small part of what I do.
Yeah. So what's your sense as we've had this COVID-19 stop us, and you can't go back to the office pretty much. I mean, you're seeing your students virtually now, teaching virtually. What's your sense of how students are doing, the community is doing in reference to COVID-19? How are you doing being cooped up over there?
Well, actually, I'm very privileged, very fortunate. I don't know, you can probably see the sunlight. I can take a walk. I can do that if we do it every day. My wife, her and I have really experienced that a lot more. So that's been a positive. We're obviously, together a lot more cooking. I mean, we were the worst, eating out all the time. But doing overall pretty positive. Go to the store if I have to, got my mask. Playing golf now, that helps. So even that social distance, but overall doing pretty good. I think from a health perspective, mental, and that was one of the first questions I asked my students 7 weeks ago. How are you doing? And they had to write it out journaling. So that was really a good experience for them. I think they wanted someone to ask them, and they were able to process it and really, focus on how they're doing. So that was definitely, online is definitely different. I mean, I still kind of struggle trying to figure this out, but I'm learning. Most of our students were able to kind of access. Our college was very fortunate. We provided laptops if they needed it. Most were fine. The rural areas struggle a little bit, but most of their students were able to access that part of it, including my daughter and her friend. I mean, Sadie's taking a class right now at TC, but no problem with that. But it's definitely generations too. From the older students, they want it in person, so they're not real happy. Especially, I don't want to talk about the fall yet. I don't want to bring that up. But I think we got to think about the new normal, and I think that's kind of the realization for all of us. That's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. Well, we got to get you out of here, but I wanted to ask you what this time has taught you about yourself. I mean, I feel like we're all having to do some introspection, some looking inside. I mean, what has COVID-19 quarantine taught you about yourself and the new normal? I mean, what do you think? What do you feel is to come, particularly as it relates to Indigenous peoples in the next 25 years?
My cousins and I have talked, and they live literally 90 miles to the nearest town. And I have an older cousin, she's based on my sister, and she's a few years older than I am. This is nothing new for her. I mean, and laughing about it, but they grew up in poverty. They grew up in isolation. They grew up where they were looking for, food, one meal a day. I mean, and that close knit. So for me now, definitely taking that pause and realizing what is important, family, and just kind of focusing on yourself and the really critical elements of your life and food, health, enjoying the outdoors and the environment definitely has just slowed us down a little bit, and reaching out. And I think that's something that's helped me. I never used FaceTime before this. Now, I call people using FaceTime, and so I've definitely done that. And I have my list of people just to reaching out and connecting with people I haven't talked with in a while. So that has definitely been positive, and see how they're doing. So just slowing down a little bit, I think there's nothing wrong with that now. Yeah. Maybe not what we're doing from outside in our world and the economy, but definitely what is important, what is not.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. Our last question is, what have you been watching, reading, listening to? Is there any good stuff you picked up? Because we've been trying to give people some suggestions because people got a little extra time on their hands. So is there anything you've read, watched, listened to that you want to share to our what to do while on quarantine list?
Well, I'm a reader anyway, so I've been reading, but nothing. I probably had 5 books that I was reading before COVID. Now I got to finish 2 or 3 of those. Okay. Watching TV. I mean, I watch TV, but I'm not a binge. I heard Pastor Jamie talk about once he gets on a show, he goes all in. Okay. I'm not there yet. My wife, she does that. I'm just not there. I've seen watching the one you got me hooked on, Homeland. So I'm on season 6. I had to watch 4 and 5, even though I watched it about 5 years ago. I had to watch it again. So now I'm catching up with it. I just kind of follow what my wife follows a little bit. She's several of those shows in the last, but I refuse to watch Tiger King. So I'm not going to say nothing about who's watching it. Okay. But really, I just watch TV. My wife doesn't watch commercial TV, regular TV. She refuses to. So I'm trying to do that. I haven't watched Last Dance. I kind of watched a few sports shows here and there, but nothing real. I just kind of, because I'm working all day. I'm trying to keep that same routine. You were going back to that. I get up in the morning, I'm taking a shower, getting dressed. I go, doing this. So I'm grading. So by 6, 7 o'clock, go for a walk. And by 8 or 9, I'm slowing down. So I don't have a lot of time. I'm in bed by 10:30. So that's kind of trying to, now, a weeks from now, I get out and I got all these projects, to-do lists. My house looks good. My yard looks good. So we're definitely doing that.
Yeah. Well, listen, my brother, we appreciate you taking us to school today and really giving us some insight on some real key terms, some issues that people probably just don't have anybody that they can really ask and talk to. And appreciate all the good work and especially all the good things and good work you've been doing with myself and the conference, because I think our conference is a better conference because of the work you've been doing with us. And hopefully we can keep at it the next 25 years.
Right.
And just know that WPC-TPI appreciates you and your work, man. And thanks for joining us. Take care of yourself, be safe, and hopefully I'll see you soon somewhere in green pasture.
I totally agree. So take care.
All right, my brother. Appreciate you. Bye-bye.